I'm Kwame Wino. I work at the Institute of Economic Affairs, which is a think tank based in Kenya. And I'm glad to be here to moderate this interesting discussion about a new phoenix. So two things are certain. One of those is change, and the dynamism of that change, the pace of that change is less evident. But I think discussions such as this in the last couple of years make it clear, or rather speak as if it's self-evident that certain things in the geopolitical world order is changing. The direction and the pace are not necessarily known, though of course we hear assertions that they're clear. Out of that also comes an assertiveness of what we call the global south, whatever that configuration means. It confuses me as well at times. But regardless of that, I think global changes are happening. It's happening in ways that will affect how international institutions are built and how they make decisions, how those decisions are even enforced. But in addition to that, who is making those decisions? Some of these are clearly driven by economic and political changes. I think the notes that we were given as part of this talks about the fact that in the next 20 years or so, perhaps less, the four largest economies of the world, four will be those that are known as three quarters of the four largest economies in the world will come from what is today called the global south. I think you know which countries those will necessarily be. And with that kind of change in the configuration, but just the kind of change in how productivity and economic welfare, certainly that will affect the political world. I think as I come to the end, two things. As a student of economics, we take it for granted that exchange matters, and when people exchange things, regardless of who it is with, that in itself is enough. I think reality slaps us in the face again and again by saying, look, people care as well for who they're exchanging with, in whose borders, and what the regard of one person or one group of people has for the other. So part of this question is not just economics and driven by economic factors, it's also driven by a very strong sense of identity, and that's not to be debated. But I'll suspend my comments for this. I'd expect us to take three things from this, or at least those are my three questions. One, is that change, I think we accept that change is happening, at what pace, and what are some of the factors that are driving it. And the second one is change and progress. Change is a given, progress not. Is a kind of change we are going to see generating some progress, and if not, I think how do we push whatever levers, institutional, political, to ensure that it goes in the right way? Because I think change as an end in itself is not necessarily one good thing. And I think I've heard voices of the African continent saying, look, change for its sake is not something to be celebrated. So we'll have our panelists here, and I'll have the first panelist, which is, I come from the African continent, we tend to be very tonal, so if I mispronounce your name, please forgive that. Mnatsakan Safaryan, who's the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs in the Republic of Armenia. So you have 8 minutes, please go ahead, sir.
Let me first start by reflecting on some of the discussions from previous sessions yesterday. Our former Minister of Foreign Affairs said in his panel that polls matter or polls are central, while the former President of Lithuania said that small nations should be irritants to the big ones. And I also noted Samir Saran's question as to who leads the global south, and his answer was no one. So this made me think that the world system is more of a constellation rather than a multipolar system. It's a constellation with its own gravitation force that keeps the system in balance, and even when a small state is out of orbit, the whole system is insured. In today's globalized world, unrest in one place echoes developments in others, and economic crisis, conflicts, disruption of supply chains, climate change leave a negative effect on all parties involved. But consequences of such challenges are felt worse in global south. The global south often faces common challenges, and those challenges drive efforts for economic development and cooperation. At the same time, those challenges differ from country to country, from region to region. While some of countries in Global South, for some of those countries, remoteness, dependence on ocean resources, lack of water resources, vulnerability to climate change impacts are main obstacles for sustainable development. Others suffer from geographical location and consequences rising from that. As a landlocked country, Armenia has been blocked from the east and west for a very long time, and it has faced challenges that not only hindered our path to meet the achieving the sustainable development goals, but also posed a threat to the country's national security and stability in the region and in broader sense. And we have spoken about the crossroad of peace during the previous panels. It was presented by our Prime Minister Nicole Pashinyan, and this is actually and essentially a project, an initiative that connects Global South to Global North. And in this regard, I have to mention that the role of India and its efforts are noteworthy. The Voice of Global South Summit provides an effective platform for developing nations to speak out, to manifest their concerns and challenges, voice their priorities and share their achievements. Armenia is diversifying its foreign policy, economic policy, security relations, and we are diversifying it to different directions and including and very prominently to the Global South. I would also like to mention that this dialogue, the Yerevan dialogue, is actually an initiative and an event that was essentially a share of good practices from our Indian colleagues, Indian partners, and this is an example of effective cooperation among Global South and sharing their experience. One more such initiative is Armenia joining International Solar Alliance. That was actually proposed to us by our Indian colleagues. And to answer your question, there are positive developments in this regard, and we have to work jointly to make joint efforts to ensure that most of these initiatives, most of these practices are positive.
All right, so we go now to VJ Chalpaiwale, who's in charge of the Department of Foreign Affairs.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you to the organizers of this great event, both to Foreign Ministry of Armenia as well as the Observer Research Foundation. This is a great initiative. Friends, let us accept the fact that most of the global institutes, those who are controlling both narratives and policies in today's world, are the product of World War II. And therefore, the allies have created these institutions built for their own interest. And large population, many countries have been denied to have those kind of privileges in that system. During that period, India and many other countries have created a platform called non-aligned movement, which essentially was a passive platform of not their, it actually reflects their inability to take sides on the global issues. Now, the countries like India and many other in those parts of the world, those who have been denied their due rights on the global issues, are trying to come together and fight the challenges and also harness the opportunities that have come in terms of advantages due to their demographic advantages, large resources of the minerals and the critical materials, and also technology. Maybe it is health. Yesterday we talked about the digital public infrastructure and many other. So I think Global South is now at a very unique position to at least drive the narratives and create the policies which will protect their self-interest and also give solutions to various problems which are facing in today's world. And I will give you the classic example of COVID vaccines, that if India would not have been there, half of the population of world would have been remained without vaccination, because the vaccines provided by the Western countries were simply unaffordable, and neither they had production capabilities for such a large volumes. So there is a possibility of win-win situation if the countries of Global South come together. I'm sure you know that till India presided G20 in last year, entire African continent was not represented in G20. So now with the G20, in fact it is now G21, this major anomaly has been rectified due to the leadership of India. And there can be many examples like this. Even for the issues like climate change, today whatever deterioration we are seeing is mainly because of overexploitation of natural resources by the West. Now we have to find out the common solutions which will give us affordable and equitable solutions to this great danger. I am not denying that there is a great danger to the climate, but availability of the technology and availability of the resources to implement those technologies is also equally important, and Global South is ready to play a major role in this. I think in this context, Global South actually represents both great opportunities and also challenges. The challenges like terrorism, extremism, climate change, availability or non-availability of the technologies, and most importantly, the democracy. And in many parts of the world, including some countries in Global South, are facing threat to democracy, and that also is worrisome. But at the same time, the opportunities are enormous, and as Samir Saran yesterday said, that there is no leader, and that is the strength of Global South, because with the collective responsibility and collective leadership, I am sure the Global South will be able to create not only new narrative, but also provide unique solutions that will cater the needs of the large population of the world. And thank you very much.
All right. Our third panelist is Mr. Igosa Sagai, who's the Director General of the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs. And as you go through your comments, I mean, I think a point has just occurred to me, and I think you are the person to perhaps discuss it as well, in addition to your comments. One of those is that African representation in the G20, or G21 as everybody says, has been hyped, celebrated for good reasons. But it seems to some people who are sensible but cynical that, quote unquote, Africa doesn't know what to do with it. Is that true? Okay, so I think everybody celebrated when Africa's admission, if I may say, as a member of the G20, right? But it's been celebrated. I think everybody's lauded that, and I think India gets a pat on the back from many African countries, leaders, for doing that. But it doesn't seem to me that Africa, if indeed it is possible to have one seat representing the whole continent, knows what to do with that seat at the G20. Is that true?
Thank you very much, moderator. I'll come to that question at the end of my presentation. Let me join everyone here to thank the organizers of this dialogue. We need many more of such dialogues to give content and traction to the whole movement called the Global South. Now, I like the imagery that has been chosen for this session, which is a phoenix. The phoenix is a legendary bird. The legend says after 500 years, it decays and then it begins to resurrect. So maybe the Global South has had its day, the 500-year decay period, and now it's resurrecting. And the question is, to what ends, and how should the world now respond to this rising phoenix? Now, I like to be historical and chronological. This is the context within which I think it's best to look at the kinds of possibilities in the opening new world. Now, when the Global South, then known as the Third World, emerged in the 1960s, 1950s, and so on, it was into a world that was greatly polarized, a world that was waiting to get the new world up for peaks. You either join this or you join that. And the Global South at the time was very tactical and strategic, immediately recognizing its place in human history. It says, we're not going to be drawn to the right or to the left. We would rather focus on a middle of the road, trajectory, which gave birth to the non-aligned movement. And this was, actually very positivist, because it was not non-aligned in terms of not being pro-West or being pro-East, but saying we want to do what we want on our own terms. And that's positive neutrality. And you would find that the first generation of Global South leaders very, very astutely complied with the kinds of imperatives that came with such a decision. Now, move over 60 years after that and come to the present situation. The world is a little different. We've moved from the end of history, as the philosopher told us, when we had the whole world under the captivity of neoliberalism and unipolarity, to a world that is beginning to open up and create many centers of power. So today we talk multipolarity, but we also recognize that the Global South is again at the point where we were 60 years ago, namely that there is an emerging Cold War in a different name, and that the world is now again in the recesses of, would you join the right or would you join the left? The difference this time, however, is that the Global South is now more conscious of its very delicately balancing role in the new world. And therefore, it's no longer just simply positive neutrality and non-alignment. It is simply saying we also have a role to play. Now, but how is the Global South going to be able to play that role? Many think that the Global South is still very divided. And how would those divisions work out? Now, this Global South must recognize, the opportunities that immediately present themselves. The whole notion of state fragility is a Global South phenomenon. Now, but you find that state fragility is a global responsibility in which, if left to the so-called superpowers the way we have known them, would never find any solution. So state fragility is a challenge for the Global South to confront. It must deal with it. Second is, many of these fragile states are not in a position to help themselves, and therefore they must depend on external help. If that external help is not going to become the basis for a new battleground, such as we have found in many parts of Africa, then the Global South must wake up and have many of those things done. But how? I would suggest that Global South coalitions, very strong regional organizations, should take their rightful place in dealing with matters that in Africa we say the time has come for Global South solutions to Global South problems. We're not going to wait for distant solutions, from people who are only interested in us joining A or B. Now, how do you strengthen that kind of capacity? you have to also industrialize. And many of the fragile states in the global south are de-industrializing and not industrialized at all. So the champions of the global south in the industrial calibration must give traction to the rest of the global south, through what, if you like, you can call benevolent industrialization, global south style. The global south also has to strengthen its global south trading capacities. Now, in Africa, there is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement that makes Africa the largest market in the whole world. Now, that's the kind of model that the global south should pursue. The global south is not going to get the traction if all of its trade remains with unequal exchanges, with the West and the rest of the world. The global south has to do more for itself. Of course, I recognize that underlying all of this, the global south must have a consciousness of being together, and that requires coalition building everywhere it is to be found. And the multilateral organizations present the platform for doing this. The global south is very clear that the United Nations needs to be democratized. The United Nations needs to open up to global south increased representation. The Security Council itself must be democratized, and the global south must have a larger say in the affairs of the United Nations. What is true of the United Nations is true of the Bretton Woods institutions, and the global south must provide financial alternatives, viable alternatives to these kinds of centers. The global south cannot deal with problems of a universal nature except it finds itself within them. And that's the way to go for, say, climate change. Climate change is not going to have its traction in the global south except the global south contextualizes those issues and begins to say, hey, wait a minute, we have our own ways that are self-determined for dealing with these issues. Now, let me respond to the question about Africa's membership of the G21. Now, for many people, Africa is a single unit, which is just as well. I mean, how many times would you find the United States of America, you say, I come from Nigeria, they say, oh, well, how's my friend in Mozambique? And they have to be reminded that Africa is so diverse. Mozambique is not Nigeria. We're all part of Africa. Now, that immediately begins to tell you that to get a lone voice for Africa is a good thing because Africa teaches the world how to build coalitions and how to speak with one voice. What in South African cultural phraseology we call Ubuntu. Ubuntu is what makes all Africa one. But still, the point in that membership is that it offers Africa now an opportunity to gain the traction of consultation and participation because that's the strength that Africa has. So it's not -1, it's a strong +1 because Africa has said, for instance, if you're going to have an African representation, if you're going to have an African seat in the United Nations, we don't want individual African countries to be consulted and to be brought in from the outside. Give that role to the African Union. We have the capacity to determine who would have that seat. So in the G20, which is now G20 plus 1, the world will there learn that from the global south represented by Africa, there's a lot that we need to learn about doing things and working together. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. So to our next panelist, Guadalupe Dona, who is a professor and researcher in political science at the Universidad Torcanto di Tella in Argentina. Welcome.
Thank you very much. We are flipped in the chart, so this is me over here. So thank you very much for allowing me to share some thoughts in this very distinguished panel. It's been an honor to have been invited. So when I was first invited to participate in this panel, my reaction was, how can my data-driven public policy background actually help in this discussion? And it took me a while to get this idea emerged, but I believe that when it did, I found it really compelling. So let me just share it with you. So the first thing that came to my mind, and I'm sure that many of us have this thing in our mind, and many of my esteemed colleagues have touched on this thing, is that a new global order needs to tackle the incredible injustices that are going on in our region. So just to tell you, I live in Argentina. It's a country that has been in democracy for the last 40 years. We have not been hit by great climate change or great climate change things going on in my country. And even though we have 7 out of 10 children below the age of 18 living in poverty. That's 7 out of 10. This is a statistic that is really sad. Of course, the stories behind these statistics are even sadder. I'm sure that everyone here knows their own sad statistics, and we know that we cannot go without doing things about these terrible inequalities. So that's the first thing that I would say this new global order will actually need to address. But of course, I'm not saying with this that we don't have to think about economic progress. Of course not. Economic progress is what makes the pie as big as possible, and the bigger the pie, the bigger the slice of that pie that goes to those most in need. We know that that slice, the bigger it is, the greater the good it can make, and it's still not big enough. But what's more important is that we don't know what's the impact of that small slice going into those in need. So this is where I think that my background, and I think that data can have a very powerful voice. So it's where I think that we can actually think about data as a very great ally to help us navigate these great inequalities. Because like it or not, data shows us pure, simple truth, impartial way of showing the truth, a way that is politically unbiased. So by harnessing data, let me tell you 3 things that we can do with data. First, we can identify our present inequalities with precision, something that we don't even know. 2, we can target interventions for our very limited resources. And 3, most importantly, we can measure and we can have the impact to know what actually does the things that we are doing, and we can adjust in consequence. So advancing an evidence-based agenda seems kind of obvious once put it this way, right? It's like, it's the way forward. We have to do evidence-based policymaking because it's the way to learn what is good and what is going to the people most in need. If we are getting from every dollar, every drum, every peso that we're spending, the objectives that they are looking up to. But I have to tell you that after 15 years of trying to push this agenda, I have found a lot of difficulties. There's a lot of problems trying to push this agenda. Resistance to change, lack of resources, fear of what the data can reveal, all hinder progress in this area. I was glad to be yesterday in a panel on digital public infrastructure. If you have not been there, I really encourage you to look for the speakers there because I feel that there's a huge prospect in those areas. This public digital infrastructure has the potential to shrink the leakages that go to welfare systems, which is huge for countries like us that have so limited resources. Just wonderful. Just look for those people. There's a great deal of things going on there. So, but we in the world still don't have this digital infrastructure going on. And in the meanwhile, let me tell you that while information can be challenging, can be expensive, might demand political will to act upon, it can actually be not that difficult. So let me share just 2 projects I'm actually currently working on to show the impact that we can have when we use data in the right way. First, we are trying to detect early signs of abuse and neglect in children. What we are doing is trying to see if we can find out of drawings that children do at school early signs of maltreatment and abuse. This is figures that fly very low under the radar. It's very difficult to know what's the actual numbers out there, but it is estimated that sexual abuse, it's prevalent for like 18% of girls and 8% of boys. Those are figures that are heartbreaking, and the actual kids that get into the protection system is a very tiny fraction of those. So if we can actually have a way of detecting these early signs of neglect and abuse, we can target very early interventions that are timely, that are locally based, and that can actually break these cycles of abuse. So this is a project we're going through, which has this potential to detect these early childhood early signs of neglect and abuse, and which is read by an algorithm. So algorithms are trained to try and see what the signs in these drawings are, which makes it really cost effective. It's a really cost effective way of having this data that is so incredibly important for public policy. Second example, so we are mapping informal settlements. So you might know that there are around 1 billion people nowadays living in these informal settlements. Most of these, if not all, are in our global south. These informal settlements have this nature, this very dynamic nature. They grow, they densify, they expand, and knowing where they are and how they grow, it's very difficult. It's a very expensive way of getting this data. What we are doing, and we are not pioneers in this, there are many other people doing it in Africa, it's a great deal. We're using satellite imagery, high-resolution satellite imagery, which are free for use. And we are also training an algorithm that allows you to detect these informal settlements, and what's more important, they allow you to see how they grow in real time. This is an impressive thing to have as a policymaker. Urban developers, people that are targeting things for those most in need. It's data that is out there. It's not that complicated, and it's, of course, great to have. So we can harness what technology has to bring us. And if you ask me, I envision a world where we don't only rise in economic rankings, but that where we actually create a more global and just economy for us all, where we can actually measure the impact of every dollar, every dram, every peso that goes to those most in need. And what's more importantly, that we have the courage and the political will to act upon those data. So that was my compelling argument. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our final panelist is Nada Al-Hajiri, who's the president of the Yemen Information Center. Please go away.
Allow me to start by thanking Samira and the ORF team for inviting me, along with MFA Armenia. It's a pleasure to be here. I think there's an acknowledgement in this panel that the concept of the global south as a concept is analytically flawed, and yet we still use it. It's still here. And it's becoming even more popular. And I think this is a reflection of the times that we live in, because analysts are rightly saying that there's a return to the Cold War dynamics. And the problem with looking at the world like that is that you look at the world through a purely realist framework. And that means that you're looking at everything in terms of great power competition, and the dynamics in the global south and the richness of our history and our culture gets lost in the mix. And I want to say that Samir yesterday offered us a very interesting framework for thinking about the global south. Let's, for a moment, or for the purposes of this panel also, consider thinking about it as a collection of or emerging and developing countries taking back their identities. And I think that's really, really important, because what we want to do is to counter the narratives about our countries, and they're oftentimes negative. And through the work that I do at Yemen Information Center, one of our primary objectives is to offer an alternative perspective than what dominates the news and what dominates the world about Yemen. Everyone thinks about Yemen in the through the lens of the conflict that it's experiencing. But Yemen is much more than that. It has so much history, so much culture, so many youth who are willing and able to contribute to their country, to the world, and we need to build their capacity. We need to think about training them, but also we need to think about presenting and highlighting positive examples from the world and from Yemen so that we can all talk together, which is why I liked also the panel yesterday, the very last one on multicultural dialogue. And I think we really, really need that, because yesterday I heard a lot of people say there's a lack of mutual respect. And when we think about this term, the lack of mutual respect, that means that diplomacy doesn't have, the enabling environment that it needs to have to be productive. And so another example I want to share is that, the Global South has shown an ability to collaborate on global issues like climate change, counterterrorism, AI, and global pandemics. These are global challenges that no one country can tackle alone. And so we need to think about really focusing on, avenues for collaboration, which is why continuing to think about the world in global South, global North terms is problematic. It kind of adds this divisive, confrontational approach to addressing problems. And I'll give you an example. For example, when we talk about reform of multilateral institutions, oftentimes it's the West pitted against the rest, and it couldn't be further away from the truth. It is reform of multilateral institutions is not about only, countries around the world having representation. It's about the massive dysfunction that is taking place in these institutions that are, no longer being effective in the work that they're doing. And so I like India's approach to talking about or advocating for reform, because they engage the West. They say we need reform, we need a place, we need to be represented, but also not discounting the need to continue to engage with Western countries. And I think I'll wrap it up here.
Well, I think the question of the global South has important, or rather resonates with people who are sort of very, very significant identity. And so while I agree with Nada that it's analytically problematic, very, very problematic, even if you come to the African continent especially. But I think, in my view, it's a very useful, quote unquote, weaponized word for signaling certain things about what part of the world feels excluded, generally. And I think that's for that reason, we need to actually labor a little bit more to give it either an alternative term, but I don't know that it's acquired an identity of its own, and that'll be really, really difficult. So that's one. The second thing that I think, if you're going to talk about a new global order, and remember, our title here is about the phoenix rising. The world as a whole and the global South, to use that term advisedly, perhaps the world needs to ask ourselves, if you're talking about the global order, then we need to define problems together. And when you define problems together, it is then possible to rank them. Because one of the other problems I have with the global South is it's a whole basket full of things. And we understand that regardless of where the world is today, there's a scarcity of anything. Attention, scarcity of resources. And so which ones come to the top, or which will be resolved, will depend on, quote unquote, the global South working with the alternative, or whoever the other side is, to actually create a hierarchy of what the questions should be, and then sitting together to ask them. So that comes to my second question for each of you. I know we need to come to the audience, but I'll ask each of you to comment on this. If I were to rank these things, what do you think are the priority global public goods in which an alternative perspective or just the voices of global South would be? And I think one of them is reform of global institutions. I think that's clear, both in terms of numbers, identity, and their role. I think institutions are dysfunctional, not because they are quote unquote managed by what identities, but just because the world has moved and obviously the original functioning, the original conceptualization needs to be rejigged. So I think about this as global public goods. I'm not too sure which ones would be, but I think global peace is one. The second one would be global poverty. I think that's important. Of course, we have the SDGs on course. It's very, very clear that by 2030, I think we'll miss some of those targets. Reform of international institutions, and of course, the question of climate change. The one I am not too clear about, and I'm not being cynical here, is I don't know how the Global South will gain anybody's respect, because respect can't be demanded, right? It's about persuading people to think that respect would emerge over time on the basis of performance, on the basis of repeated conversation. So if we are to rank these four, global public goods, climate change, global poverty, or poverty in general, and reform of multilateral institutions, what am I missing from this list that you might add? And I'll start here again, go around the other way, and hope that by the time we have each spent a minute or two on that, we'll go to the audience.
First of all, I would like to thank all the panelists for their views expressed. It's a really interesting discussion, and I learned a lot from this exchange. I would add, answering to your question, I would add security, because that is the environment that creates possibility for everything else to happen. Although it's not the panacea for everything, but that is the dimension that the countries find mutual respect and mutual also common ground where they can share their problems, share their concerns, and to create an environment where all the other problems can be solved in a timely manner. Although I completely agree with the notion that this generalization of every time you make a generalization, it creates some other issues with finding more specific notions of what is happening. So and in this case as well, and this is why I said that in my view, what is happening in the world system is a creation of a constellation of a constellar system that is actually countries, bigger, middle, smaller, and all of them depending on each other.
In addition to whatever has been said by my previous speakers, I would put healthcare as another priority, because COVID is not the last pandemic, especially new kind of viruses coming from animal origin to human, like the latest incidences of monkeypox, will put a new challenge, and most of the people who will be affected by this will be people from Global South. So we need to have advanced preparedness and the solutions, both in terms of prevention as well as diagnosis and therapy, about such kind of upcoming epidemics and pandemics, and to have effective management of the same.
I think the most all-encompassing has to be security. Security, because all of the other things come within a secure framework. Poverty, of course, is critical. It's underlying, all of the problems. If you have a critical mass of poor people, there's very little progress that can be made. But you need security. And I think that the greatest problem, arguably, in the Global South today is the fact that people don't have security, and therefore they migrate from their countries, they get displaced, they get thrown out all over the world, and that exposes them to all the other things that we'll talk about. But give security, I'm sure that Poverty can be addressed within that framework. Pandemics can be better addressed and so on. But where there's no security, it is very difficult to address these other dimensions.
So, of course, I agree with all that you have already said, but if I have to add something, I think I would add cultural heritage. I think that one thing that it's really important is that we preserve the very particular nature of our culture, which I think it's really distinguishable from what we see like in the hegemonic powers now. I have this deep feeling that here in the global south, we are more united to our communities, united to our families, have a less individualistic sense of being. I might be wrong. It's something that data has not been, I have not been able to crunch the numbers around this idea, but I believe that there's something very important that can actually make our societies really resilient. So, and I think that that is ingrained in our cultural ways of going. So I think that I would add that to the list, yes.
Thank you. And I would like to echo what everyone said. I do agree with everyone, but I would also say that they're all, perhaps security is important, but I think everything is interlinked. And more important is the attitudes by which we approach these global issues. We have to let go of the you're either with us or against us perspective when we engage in dialogue, when we engage in collaboration, because without that, we're not going to reach, it's going to be a deadlock every time.
All right, so you've heard from our fine panelists. I'll take 3 questions from the audience. So this is all that's required. Please state your name, and if you have a question to a specific panelist, I'd be glad to hear it. And I'd prefer as well, just as we have gender balance on the podium, to have at least 2 questions from ladies and 2 from gentlemen. So I'll start at the end with the gentleman already holding the microphone. He's hijacked the dispensation. I will submit to you for that. Yes, please go ahead. Not more than 2 minutes, please.
Yeah. Good morning. First of all, thank you very much, all the distinguished panelists, for educating us with your views, articulated with so much of clarity and conviction. I have a very small observation and a very brief question. My observation is that, today's global south, the global south of 2024 is much different from the third world countries of the 50s and 60s. The qualitative difference is that today, amongst the global south, we have a large number of countries which are at very high stage of development, fastest emerging economies. In short, the voice of global south today is much stronger and in a position to shape the global agenda. So in this backdrop, I would like to have your views, distinguished panelists. Is the time right to create a formal institutional framework for global south, or is it premature? Otherwise, we will keep discussing, deliberating, and forgetting. Go back home, and the matter is over. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One other hand?
What was stated was an ideal situation, that there should not be. It is more a statement, an idealistic statement. But in reality, beneath the veneer of solidarity and all that, you could sense undercurrents of competition and rivalry. So major South countries, so-called, China especially has launched a charm offensive to quote global South, Africa. Brazil itself is positioning, in G20 presidency is a classic example. And India has hosted 3 editions of the Voice of South Summit. So I'd like a more realistic appraisal that is this competition for real, and what does it mean for the global south going forward? And one very brief question to the speaker from Nigeria, Mr. Sagi. The inclusion of African Union in G20, what has it meant to Africa on the ground? Or what difference would it make, tangible difference? Thank you.
Well, I provided opportunity for 4 questions, 2 from ladies. It looks like they've seeded that. Oh, yeah, right at the front. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Just to make up the gender balance, I'm Anna Shiko, the ambassador of Hungary to the region, Georgia and Armenia. You said last that we need to address the us and them problem first and actually be open. We see a new bloc formation everywhere. happening in the world. And we know in the last 100 years how blocks and how Cold War, etc., actually stopped connectivity. I wonder how you see the future of connectivity from the south to the north in the upcoming years.
Thank you. Maybe I'll take that question. So in my view, the creation of blocks, especially by the Global South, is a statement more than it is anything else. So they see that they've been saying, we want to be included in these major multilateral institutions. We want to be included in the larger financial economic prosperity that's happening in the world, but they're not given the avenues, or maybe they have very the requirements to join are very difficult. So they're attracted to these different blocks that enable them to have a voice and maybe to expand their reach. Granted, now having separate blocks is not useful, because you can't create a block for everything that you couldn't join. At the same time, it's whatever you think of, for example, the creation of the BRICS, whatever you think of it, some people think it's a great sign, it's a danger to the Western-led world order. Some people think it's not really effective, it's not going to be useful. I see it as a signal by the Global South. Our voices are not heard. We want better packages, better ability to integrate into your system. And I think if the incentives is there, they wouldn't even have to think about creating these alternative structures. We hear about countries signaling that they want to join the BRICS, I think almost every year. And so it's not going away, it's there. It's almost like countries using the BRICS to make a statement. We are here. We want to be taken seriously. We want to be recognized in our ability to influence the world. And on connectivity specifically, and I heard this mentioned in some of the panels as well yesterday, unfortunately, we live in a world where information and connectivity are being weaponized. So it links to security, it links to how we think about the collective security of the world. How do we want to think about approaching our differences and putting them aside or resolving them so that we can find some mutual space to cooperate and collaborate?
Well, first, I think, the concern that has been raised here is how to move the Global South from an idea to a proper movement, if you like. Can we think of institutionalizing the Global South? The first question to ask is, the Global South within the larger context of most possibly a global North, what are the institutional representations of a global North? I think that the Global South, is an ideological movement. It's a recognition of a difference, of a diverse world, the one that says we are not going to be led only by what comes from one part of the world. We also want to be heard. So the whole essence is there must be room for 1,000 flowers to blossom, and that the 1,000 flowers must include the Global South. Now, I think that organizations like BRICS and so on already exist, and the mandate looks like a Global South mandate, even though that has not been democratically arrived at. The point is, we'll need to have some kind of rallying center, for this whole idea to carry it forward. We must move from an awareness of being Global South to a consciousness of being Global South. The difference between being aware and being conscious being that when you are conscious, it becomes the basis for your action beyond just being aware. So I hope that that kind of traction can be developed. Now, competition and rivalry, unfortunately, these are not things we can run away from. In the Global South, just like in the Global North. But if we're going to borrow any examples from the Global North, it must be that the big leaders in the Global South must be benevolent. They must, have the responsibility bestowed on that kind of relationship, of that kind of status that they have. In Africa, certainly Nigeria is a big player, and Nigeria has historically lived up to the responsibilities of being a big brother, on the continent. So India must, China must. Now, the way that the global South, can prove to be different is, we are not simply about exploiting, differences and inequalities. We have certain values. The Indians express those values, the Chinese express those values that make us different. And I think the point about being culturally, together, those things are important. The African Ubuntu must come into this. I think that, rivalry and competition, the way we understand those terms are not, winner takes all. They are not zero sum. They are not, exploitative and so on. We must do that. I talked about the need to have a global South network of industrialization, for instance. There has to be industrialization led by these champions. We have to have common markets. We have to trade more within the global South than we are trading, with the rest of the world. Those things have to happen. And I think that if we are all led, by those kinds of values that differentiate us as culturally disciplined people from the rest of the world, we have a lot to teach the world. And that's the point, about, the global South culture. So I agree that we must also emphasize the things that make us different from the rest of the world. And for Africa, I think that if the G20 is regarded as one of the more active platforms for multilateral interactions, so it will be for Africa. BRICS, what do these things mean? They just are new alternatives to the other platforms that don't seem to be working well. So the G20 brings together the world's biggest economies. Why not? Africa is also there now that we have the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and Africa is there. We must take an active part, in all of those vistas and new ventilations that exist in the changing world. Thank you.
I'll be quick. First, on the immigration debate, I don't want to go into the domestic politics of US, but to say that the third world, if you get immigrants from third world country, you will become third world, is actually a misnomer, because the person whom himself has asked is immigrant or his parents were immigrants. And they have actually contributed significantly, those immigrants going from India to US economy. So how much immigrants to take is always a question of debate, but immigration per se cannot be stopped, and it is, on the contrary, healthier trend for overall global progress and development. As far as institutionalization is concerned, I think it is premature because there are already several institutes, and many of the members of the Global South are already participating and leading in those institutes. Also, countries like India are also being invited to forums like G7, which is all by developed countries. So I think right now, creating another institution for the Global South may not be very useful. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll go point by point. Firstly, if there is a change, and we all agree on that, there is a consensus about that, it should be reflected in the global institution. That's a no-brainer, I think. And how is it going to be reflected? The best way is to reform the ones that we have already. On a second point, there was a statement that Global South not having leaders is idealistic. But it also, I would like to say that a same kind of idealism is that these poles or the powerhouses are going to be the sole leaders of this development, because as I said, the middle countries, the small countries, all of these countries have interests. We are developing in the same pace along different dimensions, technology, for example. So I think that the interests of the middle and small countries will affect the situation, so that these so-called poles or the powerhouses in this system have to share their public good, have to bring some public good into the picture to be leaders in this system. About the connectivity, north to south, or I would probably say global east to global west, and the whole region, our viewpoint and our initiative of Crossroad of Peace speaks for itself. So we feel this need acutely in terms of economic and trade, and this is actually one of the areas where trade and economy come as a priority, and this is where the need to stabilize the situation in the world, in the region, comes from. And also I would like to comment on the question on immigration. In last years, Armenia has seen a movement of nationals from India for labor here in Armenia. So luckily, culturally, we don't have any issue with that, because our peoples know each other and are familiar with each other from centuries ago. But institutionally, we felt the need to make additional regulations, because there were some issues on the daily lives of these laborers here in Armenia. So we have created actually a working group to deal with these issues, and I believe the countries that are in need of labor immigration should have these institutions in place before this happens, so that not to have all these spillover effects. Thank you.
I know we need to break. I'll close with 3 points. So if you ask me what I've learned today, I think, or rather, the best way to think about it is for you to define common problems, and whether the global south, whichever way you call it, global south and the alternative. I think the global south has to be careful about whether its leaders or its communications instrumentalize as grievances of low-income countries, because that would be further polarizing. I think what they need to do is to close that gap. I'm not too sure that some of the rhetoric I've heard, not here, but out there, actually helps in that. So the consciousness in that leadership is essential. I also think that they could concentrate on global public goods, global security, reducing state fragility, which is a specific problem, especially in the African continent, and obviously in other parts of the world that call themselves. Africa needs to justify through the AU its G20 accession. And I think so that it doesn't look like a symbolic one. I think there's already generating quite a lot of cynicism on the African continent. This is the usual cynicism. And the final one is, I am incorrigible multilateralist. And one of the things that I think, again, global South countries need to be conscious about is, just as more global South professionals and institutions and ideas are being called into the space to inform global policy or international political economy, we should be clear that global South assertion does not shut that door. But the most important thing is, I think the global South could do some homework or assignment around making its claims more coherent. Thank you very much.